And hello, everyone. Oh, my camera is wonky. Let's make that right, shall we? Gotta love the AI camera. If I'm not exactly in the right place, it goes all wonky on me. Where did you go, camera? Where are you? Center on me. There you go. Look at you go, camera. Look at you go. Hello, everyone. Good evening and happy Saturday. We are back tonight for the second half of The Crucifix by Naomi Cashman. Well, the first half of this has been spooky. This, of course, is another indie author live read. And if you missed the first part of it, you can go and listen to it on the YouTube channel, youtube.com/@SirArminius. Or, if you don't want to listen to it, you can always stop out to Amazon and pick up the book and support the author that way. I am sure, certain, absolutely certain, she would love it if you did so. So, hey, maybe you can. Anyway, we started out with more present day, a tour of the orphanage and convent where all of these things occurred. And it was sort of a little flashback, shall we call it, or flash forward there. It was the start of it to set up the book for us. And now we went back in time to Katherine, a devious little girl. I do say devious because if you did listen in, she might have, I don't know, blatantly out and out murdered another person. They never found the body, so you just don't know for sure. But yeah, she murdered the person, and she caused somebody who was supposed to be her, call it her betrothed, her whatever you want to call it, that she convinced to go break into a house where the husband and father and proprietor and owner and all of that stuff slept with a shotgun, and well, he got his ass shotgunned. Her parents die. She was sent to this orphanage for wayward kids. And she comes to find out that it is under essentially a tyranny of oppression by Sister Nora, who is the sister in charge of the convent. We found that Sister Nora wields an iron fist and iron control of the place, and she has this crucifix, which the story is the crucifix was originally worn by Judas and helped to highlight his dark sides, which helped lead him to betray Jesus. And the crucifix has passed along and done and promoted lots of dark and nefarious things. And the more it does, the darker the crucifix gets. And now we have Katherine at this orphanage, presided over by Sister Nora, who is, well, torturing kids, killing kids, very abusive, all of these fun things. And she has singled out Katherine for special attention. And Katherine is hoping to survive until she turns 18. But do we think that she would be allowed to just go on her way when she turned 18? Who really knows? But Sister Nora has done some nasty and ugly things to her, such as ripped out her back molar, slicing her tongue in the process. Oh, well, she was wide awake, has been very physically abusive towards her, and she, again, rules this place with an iron fist, including having the father of the convent under her control. So that gives you guys a little sense of where we were at and where we are starting from. This is based on a real convent that is located in Cove, Ireland. And because it's located in Cove, Ireland, well, you know Tim's got to bring out the Irish accents as we go forward. So, well, the narration isn't in the Irish accents. You will hear them throughout as our characters speak. And that brings us up to now. So, sit back, relax, and prepare to enjoy as we dive into another night of live indie author readings with your narrator, Tim Maloney. And the book, The Crucifix, by Naomi Cashman. And here we go with 16. When Tuesday arrived, the orphanage was in absolute turmoil. The orphans were instructed to go about their chores and routine prayers as normal, but there was a heavy air of tension, and everyone was on edge, waiting for Sister Nora to snap. Apparently, the convent had had a surprise visitor the previous night. From her window, Katherine had noticed the arrival of a muddied trap and horse before she went to bed around 11 o'clock. She knew it must have been an unexpected visitor, as no one ventured to the convent that late in the night. One of the young girls, who was now lying cold in a hole in the ground under an unmarked grave, had a distant uncle who the state hadn't been aware of when she was first charged into the care of the orphanage. He had been overseas in America when his brother had passed, so hadn't heard the news until he returned home, months after the funeral. He had been trying to find his niece for weeks, and now, at long last, had landed on the steps of the convent to retrieve her and bring her back home with him. Having arrived so late in the night, he had been instructed by Father Michael to return the following morning at a more reasonable hour. Sister Nora was rattled as she waited for his arrival. Nobody had seen her this shaken before, fidgeting and muttering under her breath as she paced the floor. Everyone was walking on eggshells around her, afraid in case they would be the one to set off her towering rage. An outsider had never come to look for a child who had been placed in her care before. Katherine saw her that morning, moving in a frenzy throughout the convent in anticipation of the mysterious uncle's arrival. The crucifix, which was usually displayed with pride on top of her habit, was hidden underneath. Katherine knew she was still wearing it because the top of the gold chain was visible above her collar. Animated hushed whispers were heard in the dark corners of the room between Sister Nora and Father Michael, and he too was moving in a panic throughout the place, preparing for the visitor. The rest of the nuns seemed to be on edge too. Their total silence was unsettling, and they were all determined to keep out of Sister Nora's path. It was obvious that they weren't sure what to do with themselves. Some were clutching their rosary beads to their chests as if their lives depended on it, muttering pleas to God under their breath as they walked. Others were simply erratic as they moved about the room, unable to sit still for too long, while making sure that if Sister Nora passed them, they directed their eyes elsewhere and jumped out of her path. Katherine had been applying beeswax to the doorframes in the main living room at this time. She was feeling oddly optimistic about this visitor. Surely now, every sordid detail, the abuse, murder, and deception, would come to light. There was no way she could explain the mysterious disappearance of the girl who had been in her care. Maybe this was the twist of luck that Katherine had long been waiting for. She wouldn't have to put up with the tiresome exploits of Sister Nora for much longer. Surely the state would have to become involved. They wouldn't be able to turn a blind eye to the horrors of the orphanage anymore. With Sister Nora's every move being scrutinized, she wouldn't be able to carry out her horrific atrocities anymore. Katherine breathed a sigh of relief as she carried on polishing. Everything would be all right once this day was over. However, she dared not look up from her work in case she managed to draw Sister Nora's attention. She knew that the moments before and after the visit would be the most dangerous for the girls in the orphanage. Sister Nora would be seething once the uncle left, and would be looking to inflict pain on whoever happened to be in her line of vision. They would be living in the eye of the storm until either the officials intervened or Sister Nora snapped. Having finished her task, Katherine stood up and rolled her shoulders. They cracked and ached from the act of leaning down for so long. She took a step back to assess her work and accidentally stood upon someone in the process. Her eyes went wide in fear and her heart stopped. Thinking it may have been Sister Nora, Katherine dropped her cloth and shrunk back, nearly tripping over her own feet in the process. A firm hand reached out to steady her before she fell over, and Katherine recognized the warmth of the frail hands of Sister Sorcia right away. Despite her anxiety, she let out a nervous chuckle, letting it fall short in case anyone around heard her. Sister Sorcia picked up the rag that Katherine had been holding and handed it back to the shaking girl in front of her. She offered her an amused smile and pursed her lips as if to say, "Really?" and carried on walking into the room. Katherine looked after her fondly, so consumed with her own thoughts that she hadn't even noticed she was being watched. From the dark recesses of the room, Sister Nora's dark eyes had narrowed into menacing slits. Her movements were robotic as she reached her hand up towards the hidden chain around her neck, her jaw clenching as she did so. "What a fool," she whispered under her breath. "Katherine won't really listen. Vile vermin like her should remain isolated and alone. She doesn't deserve any friendship." She scoffed. "Does she honestly think that weak Sister Sorcia is going to be the light for her in this place? There can be no friends here, no solidarity. I've made that perfectly clear. I thought Sister Sorcia knew the consequences of going against my wishes, but it's clear the message hasn't sunk in as deep as I thought. Perhaps," she muttered as she paced the room, "their budding friendship could be the most effective way of ensuring that Katherine understands her place and stays within it. It would destroy her soul if she knew that her friend was taken from her because of her actions." The shrill rell of the bell pulled her from her malicious trance. "I'll deal with them later. Right now, there's a bigger issue to contend with." The uncle arrived, and everyone held their breath in fearful anticipation, afraid to be the one to set Sister Nora off. She straightened her back and moved with grace towards the main door. Oddly enough, all the tension had disappeared from her face, and she seemed quite relaxed. It was as if she had put on a mask, hiding her true feelings and self from the visitor. Katherine peered around the side of the door, trying to make out what was happening. She didn't want to miss a minute of this cumbersome interaction. The uncle was standing in the doorway with obvious discomfort, looking around, trying to survey his surroundings. He was a relatively young man, no more than 32 years old, Katherine guessed. He was clean-shaven with muddy brown hair and was wearing an oversized tweed jacket that she thought might have belonged to someone else, based on how ill-fitting it was. He twisted his flat cap between his hands, and his face was flushed and sweaty. Katherine guessed he was a working man, judging by his bulky and calloused hands. Sister Nora exchanged words with the uncle, who suddenly got quite agitated, flaying his arms around him in anger. Sister Nora directed him to walk ahead of her, down the hallway towards her office. He shook his head and stomped off in the direction in which he'd just been directed. Sister Nora paused and looked at Katherine, giving her a twisted smirk and shaking her index finger at her, before she strutted off after the uncle. After what felt like an eternity later, they both emerged from the office. Sister Nora, to Katherine's surprise, smiled sympathetically and shook the uncle's hand. This wasn't the outcome Katherine had been expecting. She knitted her eyebrows together in puzzlement and continued to watch their interaction. She strained her ears to hear what was being said, but she only managed to make out the final words between them. "I'm sorry I couldn't be of more help, Mr. Coleman. If there is ever anything I or this convent can do for you, please do not hesitate to reach out. God will be watching over you, Sister Nora said as she extended her hand to him. The uncle gave her a short nod, pulled on his flat cap, and stepped through the main door. He stopped, before closing the door behind him, to glance at the sheepish orphans who were observing from a safe distance. Katherine saw tears in his eyes, but he didn't look angry. Instead, his interaction with Sister Nora showed there was no ill blood between the two of them. What the hell did she say to him in her office? She thought. Her head began to spin. This was not what she thought would happen. She had been expecting screaming and shouting, and policemen being called to the scene, but there was none of that. Everything was eerily calm and contained, and Sister Nora appeared unaffected by the meeting. What was going on? The atmosphere was tense, as if everyone waited for the expected explosion from Sister Nora, but it never came. As the orphans continued to watch on it with appreciation, Sister Nora strode towards a window in the drawing room. Pulling back the curtain with one finger so she could peer out, Katherine assumed she was watching Mr. Coleman to make sure he had left the grounds. Once satisfied, Sister Nora spun on her heel to face the anxious orphans in the room. She looked at them and sighed. "Children, Mr. Coleman has been ill-advised. It's quite tragic, really," she scoffed. "A local townswoman had told him tales that his niece, Jane, was being cared for here at the Convent of Mercy. Let us hope the poor woman was simply confused and not fabricating malicious lies." She stopped for a few seconds, making eye contact with many of them as she emphasized the next point. "We know that lying is one of the deadly sins, and that she will be punished for that. Having gone through all the admissions paperwork, both past and present, with him, and finding no evidence of us having taken in any girl called Jane, Mr. Coleman has apologized for taking up our valuable time and won't be bothering us again. Isn't that simply wonderful?" said Sister Nora, with a tone of fake optimism as she moved to stand next to the fireplace. A heavy silence descended over the place. Katherine knew that Mr. Coleman hadn't been wrong. She had met Jane herself. Everyone had. It explained the whispers between Father Michael and Sister Nora that morning. There would be no paperwork to prove the girl's existence within this sad excuse of a sanctuary. Between the power of the crucifix and the devil, and the questionable skills of Father Michael, presumably with gasoline and a matchbox, Sister Nora had managed to evade any repercussions for her actions. She had committed a saddened man to continue looking for his niece, knowing full well that she was no longer walking the earth. Katherine shook her head in disgust. Today was to be the day it was meant to all end, when justice would prevail and good would triumph over evil. But once again, the darkness reigned in this godless place. Katherine saw Sister Sorcia bless herself before walking towards the door. She placed her hand on Katherine's shoulder, a quick yet comforting interaction between the two of them as she passed. The light that had been shining through the narrow window suddenly dimmed. Katherine turned around to find the source and saw Sister Nora standing there. She tilted her head and folded her arms as she smirked at Katherine. The crucifix was now proudly displayed like a malevolent beacon in its usual spot on her chest. Katherine's heart suddenly started pounding in her chest. Sister Nora had seen Sorcia's gesture of comfort. The nun stalked towards her and placed her hand right where Sister Sorcia had placed hers, eliminating any level of warmth that had been there. A shiver raked its way through Katherine's body. She was ice-cold and frozen in her spot. Sister Nora brought her index finger up and shook it back and forth, scolding Katherine like a petulant toddler. Then she looked in the direction in which the mute nun had gone and back at Katherine, making sure she understood. Sister Sorcia was now her next target. "My office, Katherine. Tonight," Sister Nora said in a cutting tone as she stalked away in Sister Sorcia's wake. Katherine shuddered again. There was no escaping being punished that night. Sister Nora had made it crystal clear that she wanted Katherine's loneliness to consume her until it was the only thing she could think of. She wanted to kill any level of hope and optimism she was clinging to until she was just a shell of a human, scarred by abuse. However, Katherine was more focused on what would happen to Sorsha. She would heal from whatever torture Sister Nora inflicted upon her, but Sister Sorsha was gentle and frail, and she couldn't even be able to cry out or call for help if she needed to. She would be totally in the hands of a cursed madwoman. She wanted to run off in search of Sorsha, to protect her and keep her safe if she could, but she knew that this was just not possible. If Sister Nora had a target in mind, there was nothing stopping her from inflicting pain on them. Nothing would ever stand in her way. If Sister Nora found her trying to warn her, she knew the outcome would only end up being worse for the both of them. Katherine turned around and with a heavy reluctance returned to her chores, swallowing back a large lump in her throat. She really hoped there wouldn't be an empty seat where Sister Sorsha usually sat at dinner that evening. Ah, Sister Nora, the twisted soul that she is, has hidden the poor man's niece from him, hiding the fact that she brutally and maliciously slaughtered her. And Father Michael helped. Le sigh, le scream. All right, let me check really quick, see if there are any questions from the audience. Remember, everyone, even though I am doing the recording and I won't stop in the middle of reading to answer your questions, I am here to answer your questions if you have them. Please feel free to send them my way. Put them on in, and I am happy to answer. I Show Games 14. Hello, hello. Welcome on in. I hope you are enjoying our tale. I see no questions, so let us continue with... Where are we at? 17. Later that evening, Katherine was waiting for the dinner bell, her stomach in knots as her anxiety grew. She hadn't seen Sister Nora or Sister Sorsha since that dreaded visit the afternoon. She still didn't know how severe Sister Sorsha's injuries were, or worse, if she was dead. She drummed her fingers across her desk, her leg hopping up and down with anticipation. At last the ding of the dinner bell rang, and all the orphans gathered to descend on the dining room. Katherine forced her way past the group of girls, pushing her way to the front of the queue, and took her seat at the table. Once everyone was seated and silent, the procession of the nuns began. Katherine strained her neck to try to make out if Sister Sorsha was one of them, and sure enough, in the middle of the lineup, there she was. Katherine let out a deep sigh of relief and allowed herself to relax a bit. Sister Sorsha was alive. That was the main thing. She squinted, trying to make out if there were any obvious injuries on the woman. The right-hand side of Sorsha's face appeared to have a tinge of blue, and her top lip was split, but she couldn't be certain. It looked like she had used powder on her face to mask the true extent of the damage. Sister Sorsha didn't make eye contact, keeping her head down just like the other nuns. Katherine started to bite her nails as her heart raced. She wanted to make sure Sorsha was all right, to offer the woman some level of comfort, to return the gesture she had received herself. The fact that the nun didn't even look over at her made her worry. Had she lost the only comrade she ever had in the orphanage? She cast a fleeting glance at Sister Nora, who was grinning at her. She's enjoying this, thought Katherine. She likes that she's blocked our friendship. Sorsha won't ever go against her now, not when she'll be subjected to pain if she does. Defeated, Katherine shrank back in her seat. She wanted to disappear. With shaking hands, she gingerly picked up a spoon and forced herself to eat the bowl of mush that they called dinner. The next morning, Katherine gasped as she plunged her hands deep into the basin of warm, soapy water. The lashings she'd received from Sister Nora the night before had left her with deep lacerations along her spine, making her grit her teeth with every movement she made. But she had no choice but to carry on. Her hands were red and stinging from the heat of the water as she pulled out another frock. She had been scheduled for laundry day, and she still had about 20 more frocks to wash before she could hang them out to dry. She always hated laundry. It had been the one chore that had always refused to help her mother with. She hated how tiring it was to run the clothing over the board multiple times, then bring out each item which was saturated with murky water. Her father's clothes were even worse, as they were heavier than both her mother's and hers combined. They also reeked of cheap whiskey and tobacco, so she had to scrub out the material a lot harder to get rid of the foul stench. Her fingers became all wrinkly and red, and sometimes sore and cracked from the pressure of pushing the clothes against a hard wooden board. With a frustrated sigh, she pushed her hair back from her face with the back of her hand before wringing out the excess water from the frock into a nearby basin. She was so occupied by her thoughts about the task she hadn't noticed someone else had entered the room. She went back to her little stool when she felt the all-too-familiar warmth of a comforting hand on her shoulder. Tears sprang from the corners of Katherine's eyes, threatening to cascade down her face. She hadn't lost her only friend after all. Wiping her wet hands on her apron, she turned to face the woman behind her. Katherine gasped and brought her hands up to cover her mouth. Sister Sorcia wasn't wearing any powder today. Katherine could see exactly what Sister Nora had done to her. Her top lip was split, and the bluish tinge that she had noticed at dinner yesterday was almost purple in patches. From the size of the discoloration on Sorcia's face, Katherine guessed Sister Nora had used a blunt object as her mode of punishment. Instinctively, Katherine reached out to touch her face, but Sister Sorcia shrank back and closed her eyes as if in fear of the anticipated pain. Katherine retracted her hand and looked down in embarrassment, scolding herself for her stupidity. Katherine swallowed a lump in her throat. "I am so sorry, Sister Sorcia. This is all my fault," she said. The nun raised her hand to stop her from saying anything further, then moved with stealth towards the large brass taps at the opposite side of the room. She turned all of them on before turning to face Katherine and putting her finger over her lips. Katherine frowned, puzzled. The nun pointed upstairs, and Katherine understood. Someone was walking around upstairs, and, judging by the unfaltering footsteps, she knew Sister Nora was standing right above them and that, for their sake, they needed to remain quiet. "I'm so sorry, Sister," whispered Katherine. The nun shook her head and pulled Katherine into a comforting hug. Katherine froze before melting into the kind woman's arms. She smelt distinctly of frankincense, so Katherine guessed she must have come directly from the chapel. But there was also a hint of sage that Katherine had begun to associate with the woman. "You're afraid of her too, aren't you?" Katherine asked, while toying with her hands. The frail nun was on edge. She kept looking around the room, checking if it was safe to talk. She reluctantly nodded her head and gestured for the young girl to take a seat. The nun pulled an empty basin next to Katherine to provide a makeshift seat for herself. The sheer fear that was written on Sister Sorcia's face made Katherine reluctant to probe the woman further, but she almost couldn't help herself. "What else has she done to you?" Katherine asked, as she placed a gentle hand upon the woman's knee. A silent tear made its way down Sister Sorcia's face as she seemed to be struggling with opening her mouth. This puzzled Katherine, as she couldn't understand why the nun would be trying to open her mouth in the first place when she was a mute. The nun leaned closer to Katherine and pointed, with a trembling hand, to the inside of her mouth. Katherine almost fell from her stool from the shock. She gasped. Were it not for the nun's hand on her arm stabilizing her, she would have knocked over the basin of water. Half of the poor woman's tongue had been cut off. It looked like it had been severed with a blunt, serrated object, causing a jagged, blackened stub to remain in its place. It had been cut right down to the very muscle, which would explain why the woman couldn't speak. She hadn't been born a mute. She had been robbed of her ability to speak by Sister Nora, in an inhumane, violent manner. Katherine had to look away from the grotesque sight for a few moments. When she tried to speak, Sister Sorcia once again raised her finger to her lips, reminding her to keep quiet. She pulled a few scraps of paper from her habit, fumbling with them as she arranged their order, before thrusting them into Katherine's hands. Katherine glanced down at the paper, now crumpled in her hands. The nun nodded in encouragement and beckoned her to read the papers. Katherine let out a nervous breath and was just about to read the first slip when a booming voice interrupted her from behind. "I warned you! I warned both of you!" Sister Nora barked in an icy tone. The sound of the running water had masked any outside noise, so Katherine and Sister Sorcia had not heard her enter the room. Sister Sorcia's eyes widened and darted toward the slips of paper in Katherine's hands. Katherine thought Sister Nora hadn't seen what was in her hands yet. She quickly crumpled them up further into a ball and dropped it at her feet. She stood up and discreetly kicked the ball away from them, eager to keep the contents hidden from Sister Nora's eagle eyes. Sister Sorcia moved toward Sister Nora, head bowed in submission and fear. Sister Nora raised her left hand, demanding that the frail nun remain still. Sister Nora directed her chilling words only to Katherine. "You stupid little girl, have I not been clear, time and time again, that your meddlesome ways have consequences? You aren't deserving of any so-called friends within these walls. You are an evil, insolent child, and will continue to be treated as such for as long as I am here. You would think, considering how many times your hands have been cut open, that you would learn to heed my warnings. Perhaps I was wrong. You're clearly too stupid for the message to sink in. I will have to greatly increase my efforts to ensure I won't have to repeat this message again. But what to do with you?" Katherine's eyes skittered to Sister Sorcia, instinctually. She hadn't meant to look in her direction, and Sister Nora noticed. She leaned in towards Katherine, tilted her head back, and let out a raucous laugh. Katherine and Sister Sorcia glanced at each other with caution, their whole bodies trembling. They didn't know what Sister Nora was finding so funny, but they both knew that they were better off not knowing, and chose to remain silent. Sister Nora snapped her head back up and turned on her heel as if to walk away. She clutched the crucifix with one hand while waving a finger between the two of them, as if having difficulty choosing between the two. Finally, her finger stood still in front of Sister Sorcia. She dropped her hand and rolled her eyes as though bored by the whole situation, but at the last minute she turned to face Katherine and smirked. Her face twisted so much it was almost unrecognizable. She was morphing into a distorted, dark form in front of her. A shroud of darkness descended upon the room as Sister Nora's back became rigid, as if being held up by an unseen force. Sister Sorcia's breathing had started to come in short gasps as she looked on with wide, fearful eyes. She dropped her shaking hands, which had been clasped together in the form of hurried prayer, and dropped her head down further. Katherine wanted to move, but something was stopping her. She was frozen to the ground. She wanted to reach out to Sorcia, but her body was no longer obeying her. The frail nun raised her head to sneak a glance at Katherine. There were pools of unshed tears in her eyes, but even then she managed to offer the orphan a weak attempt at a comforting smile. Katherine allowed herself to smile back at her, even though she knew Sister Nora was observing their every action. But it didn't matter now. It was too late to protect Sorcia, so there was no need to hide their friendship. The fact that Sister Sorcia was able to smile through her stilting fear gave Katherine a smidge of optimism. She looked over at Sister Nora, and in an instant, that optimism died. The nun was staring right back at her with cold, dead eyes, and her arms folded across her body. She smiled at Katherine so tightly her upper lip receded back into her gums. Sister Nora carelessly grabbed Sorcia by the arm and pushed her towards the door, causing the nun to stumble on her way. From where she was standing, Katherine could tell the elderly woman was sobbing, her shoulders shuddering up and down as each sob racked its way through her body. Sister Sorcia didn't look back once. Katherine knew deep down this would be the last time she would see her. Sister Nora gave Katherine one last smirk as she followed Sister Sorcia, slamming the door shut behind them. Ah, twisted, twisted old woman. That's what you get from a horror novel, though. These kind of things, they need to be there for it to be what it is supposed to be. Spooky. Ega Heraliporuta Putra? Sorry, it merged them all together. Hello, hello, welcome on in. All right, let's go check to see if we have any thoughts or comments from anybody in the audience. If no, then that is okay as well. I don't see any there, so shall we continue? I believe we shall. It will be good for all of us to continue the story as we venture towards the end. So here we go with, before that, quick drink. Gotta stay somewhat hydrated. And here we go with 18. A few minutes later, when Katherine found the courage to move again, she ran to the window to see if she could spot them. But both nuns were long gone. She couldn't even make out their footsteps in the gravel. All that was outside were deep puddles of muddy water. Katherine raised her hand to the glass in despair and let it rest there for a few moments, willing with all her might, if there was a God, that he would hear her pleas to save Sister Sorcia. She bit down on her fist to try to quiet the sobs that wouldn't cease. Her breathing had become so ragged, the window she was leaning on began to fog up. She could only see blurred shapes now when she looked outside. She sniffed and used her apron to wipe her nose. She looked around the room in despair. What was she to do now? Was she to just carry on as if something horrific wasn't happening to Sister Sorcia right now? Just go back to her chores? The pile of laundry she'd been tackling was long forgotten, and the water was now stone cold. She moved over to the taps to turn them off before the sinks were overfilled. She looked up to the heavens, searching for answers. She had once again tried to do right, both by Sorcia and herself, and in every possible way had failed. She didn't know what was going to happen to Sister Sorcia, but it was clear that there was very little that Sister Nora was unwilling to do. The very thought made her fearful, and her hands started to feel clammy. As she returned to her work, Katherine trod on something soft. She peered down. Sister Sorcia's notes! Still sniffling, Katherine bent down to retrieve the ball of papers and sank down on her stool to unfold them. After scanning her eyes over the first few words, she soon realized that Sister Sorcia had been trying to convey her story to Katherine. Why she had been so afraid of Sister Nora, and how she ended up with her tongue as it was. Katherine struggled to figure out which piece of paper she was meant to start with, as some of the sentences were difficult to decipher. Sister Sorcia's handwriting was more of an awkward cursive scrawl rather than actual writing, so Katherine had to hold the pieces of paper up to the light to try to distinguish the words. I knew what she was doing was wrong. I stumbled across her one evening 2 summers ago. I was up in the gallery saying the rosary before my nightly duties when I heard a commotion down below. It frightened me at first, so I ducked down and hid by the pew. But as the noises got more aggressive, I slipped down towards the front so I was able to see what was happening while still being safely hidden from whoever was down there. It was cowardly of me to hide, and I know that God will punish me for that when my time comes. But judging by what I saw next, God has bigger problems protecting those in the orphanage than he does with making me attest to my cowardice. There was a young girl who had only just come to us, a real slip of a girl who was trying to swing her fist at Sister Nora, but it was an extremely unfair fight because the girl was so weak. I'm not sure how it started, but it was chaotic. Pews had toppled over, and the young girl was trying to crawl away. She was completely covered in blood, whereas Nora was unscathed by their altercation. Her habit wasn't even tousled. Sister Nora was like a vicious animal. She stalked after the girl like an African lion hunting its prey, and when she managed to reach her on the altar steps, she slashed at and bashed the girl until she went limp. I must have made a startled noise from the gallery, because the next thing I knew, everything was quiet, and Sister Nora was standing over me. I don't even know how she managed to get up there so fast. She was like a phantom, her eyes wide and unyielding, and she had this calculated yet manic expression on her face. It wasn't human. I've always believed in the existence of the devil, but I had never once thought that the devil would walk among us here in this consecrated place, destroying everything we hold sacred. I didn't know what to do, so I raised my own crucifix and began to pray, but Sister Nora only laughed at me. She cut out my tongue to stop me from ever speaking of it. Truth be told, I probably wouldn't have spoken about it even if I could. If she had done that to a defenseless little child, then God only knows what she would do to me if I were to speak out against her atrocities. She still has it, my tongue. She keeps it in that old custodia that she has on the shelf in her office. It's just a shriveled piece of flesh now, but every now and then she calls me in to look at it, to remind me of what will happen if I go against her. That's why I'm so afraid of her. She isn't, she, like you and I. She is something dark and savage. She is the devil reincarnate. I am sure of it, and that crucifix of hers, the curse of the original sin it bears, it gives her a power beyond any other. Catherine didn't know why she was surprised by what she had read. She had seen the contents of Father Michael's journals and experienced the sadistic side of Sister Nora herself, but reading Sister Sorcha's stories somehow felt different. It was easy for her to distance herself from the gory details within the journals because she had never met the girl. However, reading the details of Sorcha's desperate tale and realizing the extent of her fear tugged at Catherine's heartstrings. She found it impossible to distance herself any more. Once again, she started to blame herself for having failed to protect the nun from Nora's wrath, especially after the agony she had already experienced. She had made the vital error of letting her guard down, and Sister Sorcha would ultimately pay the price. Catherine's jaw tightened as she clenched her fists. How could I have been so stupid, she thought. Catherine started to pace the room, her movements growing more agitated as the reality of the heart-wrenching situation sank in. Her only friend was gone. She hoped that Sister Nora would make it quick, that she wouldn't prolong the anguish for Sister Sorcha. She didn't deserve to be subjected to pain on her account. Catherine let the slips of paper fall from her hands into the basin of water as the bubbles consumed them, destroying the horrific words and her first real glimpse into Sister Sorcha's life in the process. Sister Nora will pay for this, she thought. I don't know how, but she will answer to me for this. That, my friends, is a sad tale for poor Sister Sorcha. All she was doing was what she was supposed to do as a nun. And Sister Nora abused her, destroyed her ability to speak. Horrific. But, for us, it's time for us to continue, shall we? With 19. No one mentioned the fact that Sister Sorcha never returned. Her usual seat in the dining hall was quick to be disposed of, making it look like she had never even sat there. Not that anyone even appeared to notice its absence. Katherine was walking the grounds later that evening, trying to pass the time before she had to go to evening mass, when she passed the rickety fence surrounding the new graveyard. She'd never had a reason to go inside the fence before, but now she felt drawn to do so. Every nerve in her body was screaming at her to venture inside. Taking great care, she opened the gate, the metal creaking as she did so, and made her way inside. She was careful to walk along the edge of the worn path, just in case she stepped upon any of the unmarked graves by accident. She reached a row of roughly dug mounds of earth that were in varying stages of regrowth. Some had grass starting to resprout, while others were still piles of mud and stone. She stopped in front of a lone mound at the end, which she thought was the most recent. A shovel lay only a few inches away from the unearthed mud. It looked like someone had tried to compact the earth, concealing what was hidden underneath. Katherine knew she had been drawn to this spot for a reason. This had to be Sister Sorcia. She knew it without needing to give the ground a second glance. She was about to kneel to pay her respects to her fallen friend when the hairs on the back of her neck shot up. Someone was watching her. She could feel their eyes observing her every movement, analyzing her reaction to discovering the grave. Sister Sorcia's horrific and untimely disappearance had made her even more wary of Sister Nora. She had a sickening feeling the nun would soon grow tired of her sadistic mind games and horrific physical torment. She turned on her heel, slipping on some of the lumps of mud in the process, and looked down to see if she could catch Sister Nora watching her. There was no one, but before turning back to the grave, she glimpsed a mysterious figure through an upstairs window. She hadn't been quick enough to catch who it was, but as she only had enemies within these walls, it could have been anyone. She took a deep breath and knelt next to the grave. Sister Nora surely couldn't stop her from saying her final goodbye. She made a mental note to pick some of the daisies that were growing by the hedge to place them on the grave. She recognized this was silly, whimsical, and frankly a little childish, and that there was a chance someone would notice the flowers and throw them away. But she felt she owed it to Sorcia to try to leave something positive on her final resting place. She noticed a light gray, roundish stone had been placed at the top of the mound, which, she presumed, was the head of the grave. Wanting to keep the grave as natural and undisturbed as she could, she decided to remove it. She was about to toss it over the fence when she noticed some strange markings on the back of it. They were difficult to make out, clearly due to the caked-on mud, but they seemed to be a group of circles, reminding her of coins. She knew she had seen the markings somewhere before, but couldn't put her finger on where. She placed the stone inside her pocket, wiped her hands on her dress, and went back inside the orphanage. She would have to figure out later why those markings were so familiar and what the meaning was behind them. Later that night, after Sister Nora had done her rounds through the girls' dormitory, Katherine leaned over the side of her bed and reached for the dress that she had worn earlier that day. She pulled out the stone and held it towards a little sliver of light that was coming through the window. Thankfully, there was a full moon outside, so she didn't have to strain her eyes too much to see the markings. She cleaned the excess mud from it using a rag that she had stolen from the kitchen during cleanup earlier that evening. She stared at the stone for a few moments, twisting it around in her hand, trying to work out where she had seen the markings before. Strangely, she recalled a conversation she'd had with Father Michael a few weeks ago. No wonder it's so familiar, Katherine thought. His words echoed in her head, clear as day. Judas received 30 pieces of silver. Of course, it all made sense to her now. She had seen the same markings on one of the worn tapestries downstairs. She couldn't believe it had taken her so long to make the connection. There were tapestries placed all around the orphanage, and each of them had a symbol on it to denote each disciple. But why, out of all the symbols to place on a nun's grave, would there be a representation of Judas? And who would have put it there? It just didn't make sense to her. She lowered her head in defeat, disappointed with herself for not being able to figure everything out and being left with more questions and answers yet again. She used her 2 index fingers to rub her temples. Her head was hurting from all the confusion. She sat, staring blankly into space for a few moments before deciding, with great reluctance, that she needed to investigate further and find out why the stone was placed on Sister Sorcha's grave. She owed her that much, at least. Katherine spent a few seconds weighing up her options. The image of Sister Nora kept intruding into her mind like an omen. She was already on thin ice with the mad woman, and she didn't want to give her any ammunition to hurt her again. But then, what did she have to lose? She was punished even when she'd done nothing wrong. So, shouldn't she at least try to pursue the answers to her questions? She would have to be extremely careful about how she went about it. Dun dun dun. Ha 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 ha. All right, what do you guys think so far? Any thoughts, comments, questions, concerns? Things that you like, things that you don't like? Anything? I see nothing. I see nothing, oh so nothing. There is nothing here from all of you. But guess what? We will go ahead and continue to read. Because that is what we should do. We continue on with 20. Sister Nora had already locked the doors in the dormitory when she had done her rounds earlier that evening, so the only way Katherine could get out was by picking the lock to her bedroom. She had broken into her father's cabinet a few times as a child. He kept his winnings from betting on horses in it. Unfortunately for him, he was always too drunk to count the money he'd won, so he never noticed when a few pounds went missing here or there. She pursed her lips together in concentration and looked around the room, searching for something sharp enough to act as a lockpick. Nothing would suffice, so she turned her attention to her bed. The base was ancient and rusting with age. She thought it must have been there since the orphanage first opened. Maintenance wasn't exactly a top priority for Sister Nora, who preferred a threadbare, impoverished aesthetic for the orphanage. Katherine pushed her mattress to the side and, using all her might, tugged one of the wires until she heard the sharp ping of it coming loose. It was quite long, but she had no other options, so it would have to do. She would have to hide the wire under her bed when she was finished, if she wasn't able to force it back into place. She tiptoed stealthily over to her door and placed the wire into the lock with exact precision. She leaned down with her ear next to the lock. It took a few minutes of wiggling the wire around before she heard the lock snap open. A weight released from her chest as she wiped her sweaty hands on her nightdress. She hadn't remembered it being that stressful when she was picking the lock back home. She was wary as she placed the wire by the door, careful not to make any noise, and stepped up to the threshold, her heart racing with each movement, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on her shoulders. She peered outside, making sure that no prying eyes were about before bravely stepping out into the hallway, which was notorious for its creaky floorboards. She would have to stay right next to the walls to try to avoid them. She edged along the dark hallway, her back flush against the cold, damp walls, and made her way to the nuns' quarters. She wasn't sure what she was looking for exactly, but decided Sister Sorcha's room would be the best place to start. She just hoped it would be unlocked. Otherwise, she would be stuck without any options. She knew the nuns had their own individual rooms, so at least she wouldn't have to contend with running into any roommates. It was lucky, too, that each room had the nun's name engraved on a wooden plate next to their door. Otherwise, she could have easily slipped into the wrong room. Her stomach dropped at the very thought. What if she had walked right into Sister Nora's room? That would have been the end of her. There would be no coming back from that. She shook the frightening thought from her head and continued making her way down the hall, searching for Sister Sorcha's room. After a while, she came to one door which was missing a nameplate. This must have been her room, she thought. She placed her hand tentatively on the doorknob. Her hands were shaking, either from apprehension or the cold. Katherine wasn't quite sure, but she managed to turn the knob with minimal noise. Thank God it's not locked, she thought. She made her way inside, shutting the door behind her. Sister Sorcha's room was exactly as she had expected it to be. It was similar to hers, containing a single bed with threadbare linen. A wooden crucifix was nailed above the head of the bed, and there was a small writing desk in the corner with a half-melted candle and a string of rosary beads lying in a neat pile next to it. There were two little windows which were so narrow they were more like slits and allowed little light into the room. The whole room had a heavy smell of sage. Katherine spotted a little box of matches beside the candle and decided to make use of what was left of the candle stump. She struck a match, and the flickering flame gave her enough light to see every detail in the room. There were very few personal items in the room, and no letters or notes left in the drawer of her desk. The only thing Katherine recognized as Sorcha's was a string of rosary beads on the desk. She had seen her take them from her pocket on more than one occasion. The stark reality hit Katherine, just how quickly a person can be gone. She took a deep breath. The familiar smell of Sister Sorcha hit her in the face like a wave, and her eyes started watering. She ran her hands over the rosary beads nervously, almost afraid to touch the only thing left of her friend. In her anxious state, she dropped the beads and they clattered to the floor. "Oh, for God's sake!" Katherine huffed as she paused her movements. She held her breath as she waited to make sure no one had heard her. The flame from the candle suddenly went out, and she was encased in total darkness. When no one appeared, she got onto her hands and knees and started feeling around for the beads. She managed to feel her way over to the bed and braced herself up on one hand while she leaned underneath to find the beads. She edged her hand underneath and patted it around, trying to feel for them. Instead of finding the beads, she felt multiple grooves on the floorboards. They were too deep and rough for them to have not been made deliberately, and they were splintering slightly. She scrambled back to the desk where she found another match and relit the candle. She brought the candle over to the bed, moved Sorcha's mattress over to one side, and kneeled back on the floor to have a better look at the carvings. Katherine's breath hitched in surprise. The same markings she'd found on the stone were carved deep into the floor. Why, oh why, are the markings of Judas on the floor of Sister Sorcha's dorm room? Why was that on a stone over her grave? What is going on, ladies and gentlemen? I don't know. I just don't know. There is an easy way to find out, though. And what is that? That's right. We will continue to read. We will read judiciously. We will read along. We will enjoy ourselves as we continue our reading of The Crucifix by Naomi Cashman, read for you by Tim Maloney. So, shall we continue? Yes, I believe we shall. As we move into 21. Katherine sat back on her haunches and pondered this bizarre occurrence. It seemed so strange to her, and she just couldn't see any reason as to why this symbol would be following Sister Sorcha. What did it mean? And what did the markings have to do with Sister Sorcha? Perhaps she hadn't even been aware they were there. Why would someone try to connect the kindly nun with someone as immoral as Judas? But then again, Katherine hadn't known her that well. Other than the torture she had endured at the hands of Sister Nora and the caring personality that she had showed her, Katherine really knew very little of the type of person her comrade was when she wasn't around. Could there have been another side to her that she was careful to keep hidden? Anything was possible, but Katherine was reluctant to believe badly of the nun who had been her only support. There must be another explanation. She snuffed out what was left of the candle, foregoing any more attempts at retrieving the rosary beads, placed the little stub of wax back on the desk, and skirted her way to the door. She waited a few moments before proceeding to open the door, straining her ears for the sound of anyone walking in the hallway before pulling the door closed behind her. Once she was certain that the coast was clear, she inched out into the hall and sprinted along the edge of the wall once again, back to the safety of her own dorm room. That part of the corridor seemed too dark and desolate. There was a faint glow of light coming from underneath the doors of the other nuns. Most of them were still awake, saying their final prayers for the night, so their candles were still alight. She could hear the low murmur of methodical prayer as if she really strained her ears. Sister Sorcia's room stood out like an ominous presence amongst the others, a reminder of the heavy existence of death within these walls. There was complete darkness even in the areas surrounding her room, and it sent shivers down Katherine's spine. She shuffled into her room and used the wire to lock the door again. She needed everything to look exactly as it had when Sister Nora had done her rounds earlier that night. She shuddered as she imagined Sister Nora's wrath if she found Katherine's door unlocked. The results would be catastrophic. She tiptoed over to her bed and moved the mattress back again. It would be better to replace the wire rather than try to dispose of it, but despite her vigorous efforts, it kept slipping out of place. She had no choice but to stash it somewhere. But where? There weren't many hiding spaces at her disposal. Hiding underneath her bed was less than ideal. Too easy for someone to find it. However, she didn't have any other options. She sighed and knelt down, then inched the wire as far back into the bed frame as possible. As she retracted her hand, she paused. The floorboards felt bumpy, just as Sister Sorcia's had been, as though they'd been gouged with something sharp. She hauled the bed frame to one side to get a better view of what was there. Katherine had a sinking feeling in her stomach, knowing deep down what was carved into her floor, but she needed to see it with her own eyes. The pattern of strange coincidences that had emerged recently could only lead to one explanation. With blustering hands, she jumped up and grabbed a nearby candle and had to strike a match a few times to be able to set the wick alight. She knelt again with caution and brought the candle right up next to where she had felt the carvings. Her breath started to come in short bursts, and the bile rose in her throat as the etching became clear. Father Michael had been right from the start. Sister Nora had been watching her, marking her, targeting her. Katherine raised her hand to her mouth to stop herself from screaming. Right under her bed were the markings of the 30 pieces of silver of Judas. They were dotted across the large space as if the coins had been tossed there. Her shaking hands were causing the candle flame to flicker, sending the etching into the dark abyss and back again. The symbol of Judas's sin was directly under where she laid her head every night. She was being tarred with the same brush as Judas. Katherine knew she wasn't perfect, that some of her actions had made her mother think there was a darkness hidden within her, especially after the incidents with Michelle and the imbecile Seamus all those years ago. Katherine still couldn't see, however, why her mother had an issue with it. It wasn't that she was evil. She'd had a good reason. All she had done was eliminate a problem that was making her own life unbearable. She was looking after herself because no one else would. Was that the reason for the markings? Did Sister Nora know about what she'd done to Michelle and Seamus? And was she making it her mission to punish her for her supposed wrongdoings? But that still didn't explain why Sorcia had been targeted as well. What did Sister Nora know about Sorcia? Had she done something in her past life that Sister Nora deemed to be worthy of punishment? Or had her wrongdoing simply been allowing a friendship to blossom in an environment that bred only darkness and despair? All the fear and apprehension that Katherine had succumbed to in the last few months vanished in an instant. Those emotions lifted from her body like a veil and were replaced with outrage. The anger that coursed through her veins was like a raging fire bubbling inside her. How dare Sister Nora play God and punish her for what she'd done? That boy was a burden to everyone around him. She'd merely done a service for her parish and herself, and she refused to feel sorry for it. He got what he deserved. As for Michelle, well, She was just too weak to justify her existence. If there was one teaching from the Bible that Katherine remembered well, it was when God had said, "An eye for an eye." If it was in the Bible, it couldn't be wrong. Could it? She stood up and began to pace the room, muttering in anger. She was so furious she could have punched the wall out of frustration. What a hypocrite Sister Nora was! After every sordid sin she'd committed against innocent people for decades, Katherine didn't care if it was the crucifix making her do it. Whatever Sister Sorcia had done would never match up to the atrocities Sister Nora had committed herself. Katherine scoffed in disbelief and blew out her candle, almost spitting at it in her haste. She pulled her bed and mattress back into its original place and lay down to go to sleep. Lying on her back, staring blankly at the ceiling for what felt like hours, her anger continued swirling in the pit of her stomach, making it impossible for her to doze off. She kept reliving the events that had occurred in the orphanage since she'd been brought there. Every agonizing stroke of pain, all the abuse and the isolation she'd felt was because Sister Nora had taken it upon herself to act as judge, jury, and executioner. A woman so obsessed with a gaudy crucifix, no, controlled by it, had tormented Katherine for something she'd committed years ago. Katherine rolled over and hit her pillow in frustration. She hated Sister Nora, hated the enormity of her power over her helpless victims. She vowed she wouldn't be afraid of her any longer. She wouldn't hide herself for fear of the extreme repercussions. Not anymore. She couldn't believe how stupid she had been, allowing Sister Nora to make her a pawn of the devil. She shook her head and smirked. She vowed that, one way or another, she would find a way to have revenge on Sister Nora. Not just for herself, but for the rest of the orphans, and Sister Sorcia too. If Sister Nora thought Katherine was evil, then she would show her just how evil she could be. She would have to come up with a foolproof plan, but her mind was racing with possibilities. Sister Nora was cunning. Katherine would have to remain quiet and subdued in case she aroused any suspicion. With her newfound perspective and the titillating taste of revenge to come, Katherine's eyes finally grew heavy with sleep. She drifted off as the heavy vibrations of the organ being played lulled her to sleep. Ah, darkness abounds for all. That is what we see here. The darkness of everyone. So let's continue delving into that darkness, shall we? 22. The following week, Katherine sat alone in the graveyard next to Sister Sorcia's plot. She just couldn't fathom it. She guessed that in Sister Nora's twisted mind, she thought her persecution of Sorcia was justified. So, what did she know about Sister Sorcia? Was she hiding a secret from her past, too? But what sordid mystery could she have concealed? It was sheer curiosity at this point that made Katherine want to know the answer to her question, but she had no resources to help her find out. Perhaps she just had to accept the fact that some questions would never be answered here. Katherine was just beginning to resign herself to this fact when she heard an awkward cough behind her. Startled by the noise, she jumped and whipped her head around to face the intruder. Father Michael was standing right outside the graveyard fence. He appeared nervous as he twisted his cap between his hands and refused to meet her eye. He gestured towards the graveyard with a limp hand, silently asking Katherine for permission to enter the grounds. Suspicious of his actions, Katherine narrowed her eyes and, with reluctance, nodded her head, allowing him to join her next to Sister Sorcia's grave. It was silent for a few moments before Father Michael broke the peace by speaking. "She wasn't what you thought she was," he said matter-of-factly. Not wanting to hear any falsities about her friend, Katherine stood up to face him as her anger poured out. You didn't even know her, she shouted. She couldn't believe the audacity of Father Michael. He sighed. You're right. I didn't exactly know her, but I know what I saw, and she was quite light-fingered. Katherine scoffed in disbelief and folded her arms across her chest. I know you don't believe it, but before you came here, there were many cases of orphan person possessions going missing. Of course, finding the items wasn't on Sister Nora's radar, so they were never recovered. There was chatter in the halls, and some of the girls began to turn on each other, but no one knew who the culprit was. That was, until Sister Sorcia was with me in the chapel one evening. She always offered to clean up after the sermons after everyone had retired to bed. It just so happened that I had a few things that I had forgotten to attend to, so I arrived later than planned that night. I think perhaps she didn't hear me entering the chapel as she had her back to me when I arrived. At first I took no notice of what she was doing, but then I saw her about to slip a small chalice into her pocket. I called out to her, and she dropped it in fright. I moved towards her, and we both bent down to pick it up. I heard a metallic sound coming from her pocket, like little small chains rattling together. Our eyes met, and she blushed. I asked her to empty her pockets, but she refused, so I reached into her pocket and pulled out some of the necklaces that had been stolen from the girls that week. I couldn't believe it. She was the last person I would have thought would steal from anyone. Like you, I had been misled believing she was an honest, gentle soul. But alas, said Father Michael before clearing his throat, looks can be deceiving. I was firm with her, told her she needed to return all the items she had taken, and I thought that would be the end of it. She shuffled down the chapel aisle, off towards the double doors, and just when she thought I wasn't looking, she pocketed something else on her way out. She couldn't help herself. It was habitual. The necklaces were never returned. Items still went missing, but the incidents weren't as frequent as they had been. Every time there were whisperings about trying to find the possessions that had been taken, Sister Sorcia would make herself scarce. She never stopped that little habit. Stumped by the tales of her thieving friend, Katherine slumped back onto the ground, lost for words. She didn't want to believe it. Father Michael had no reason to lie to her now, though, so maybe she hadn't known Sister Sorcia as well as she thought she had. There are always two sides to everyone, Katherine. You should know this better than anyone. Some people are just very good at keeping the more sinful side hidden from the world. Eventually, it gets harder for them to keep the darkness buried in a box. It starts to creep out in waves, and people see glimpses of it. At first, they weren't quite sure if they believe what they see, because the person is different from the one they knew. It takes them a while to realize it was all an elaborate facade, a ruse to hide that person's flawed self. Katherine remained quiet as she absorbed what Father Michael had said. She understood his profound observation and knew it to be true. She'd always believed that some of the village girls were putting on an act. They were just too good to be true. No one is that pure. She nodded her head, more to herself than in agreement with Father Michael, and looked up at him from underneath her eyelashes. His piercing stare hinted there was another meaning behind his words. I've been told that this particular concept may speak deeply to you and your own habits, he murmured. Katherine gritted her teeth and narrowed her eyes into menacing slits. What does he know? She thought as she clenched her fists. But Father Michael seemed undeterred by her obvious anger towards him. He clicked his tongue and strode off to the chapel with his hands clasped firmly behind his back. To the innocent bystander, he appeared very much a man at ease. As soon as he was out of sight, Katherine allowed herself to relax and unclench her fists. Her nails had left sharp indentations on her palm. She closed her eyes out of frustration and tutted to herself. Father Michael didn't know her on a personal level, and other than his sinister confessions to her a few months prior, she hadn't told him anything that would warrant that level of judgment. It wasn't possible that he knew what she had done. Sister Nora must have told him. It was evident he was more than a mere henchman for Sister Nora. She wouldn't have shared such secrets with anyone of such a lowly status. No, their relationship was much more personal than he'd admitted. The irony of it wasn't lost on Katherine. What a hypocrite! Highlighting his belief that everyone has two sides, as if he were somehow exempt. There wasn't one living person in the orphanage that this didn't apply to. Katherine had seen it all around her and hadn't thought twice about it. It was just a way of life for those living in the Convent of Mercy. Fear drove the girls to do terrible things and hide their actions. Then, in return, they let the darkness hidden deep within them emerge to the surface. No wonder the crucifix has so much power over Sister Nora, Katherine thought. The walls are steeped with sin. Dun, dun, dun. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, it is darker and darker as we move along into 23. Katherine was becoming a woman possessed. She spent every waking minute plotting how she would get back at Sister Nora, what it would feel like, the look on Sister Nora's face. But every time she thought of a possibility, it didn't feel right to her. She wanted her revenge to be monumental. She wanted Sister Nora to pay for the full extent of what she had done. She noticed the darkness beginning to ascend within her, but she convinced herself that it and her calculating thoughts were normal, that she was in complete control of herself. However, this couldn't have been further from the truth. Her thoughts were consuming her. She had lost a noticeable amount of weight, and there were dark, heavy bags beginning to form underneath her eyes. Had she been close to anyone in the orphanage, it would have been cause for concern, but her isolation meant that these changes went undetected. She lurked around the corners of hallways, hidden in the shadows, and watched every one of Sister Nora's movements. She needed to know if she had a weakness that could be exploited, and studied her daily patterns. One evening, as the sun was beginning to set, the orphans made their way to the dining hall for their evening meal. They pushed each other in their eagerness to get to the dining room for their next meager meal. By contrast, Katherine took her time. She didn't feel hunger anymore and was too caught up in her own thoughts to pay attention to what was going on around her. Sinking down into her seat, she toyed with her spoon while she watched the door in anticipation of the nuns' usual procession. All of a sudden, one of the girls sitting next to her grabbed her wrist, forcing her hand to remain still. Katherine turned to glare at her, confused by the girl's behavior. She was met by a pair of wide, doe-like eyes and a quivering chin. "Please stop," she whispered. "What are you doing? You're going to get in trouble if someone sees what you're doing," she said as she nodded in the direction of the table. Katherine looked down and understood why she had been so concerned. She had been so focused on watching the door that, without realizing it, she had been digging the spoon into the table, marking it in the process. She dropped the spoon, straightened her back, and relaxed her hands, aware that her actions had frightened the girl. "I'm so sorry. I didn't realize what I was doing. It won't happen again," she said, and gave her a fleeting smile. The young girl glanced at Katherine nervously before turning away. Katherine exhaled as a wave of calm washed over her and rolled her neck to reduce some tension. She noticed how badly she had damaged the table. The varnish was scratched off and the wood had been chipped. She swallowed her frustration. So much for remaining subtle, Katherine thought, rolling her eyes. She turned to look back at the door once again, just as the bell rang to signal the entrance of the nuns. The dining hall fell silent as the girls focused their attention on their plates. Nobody dared to look up, except for Katherine. She wanted to look Sister Nora in the eye as her first act of sheer defiance. She wanted to show her she was no longer afraid of her and refused to be submissive. The nuns made their way towards their seats in a moving wave of black and white, with Sister Nora taking up her usual place at the back of the row. Katherine clenched her hands. She couldn't help the anger stirring in her stomach and started to shake with rage. As if sensing a shift in the girl's mood, Sister Nora scanned the room until her eyes came to rest on Katherine, her malevolent smirk fading as they locked eyes. Her brow was furrowed and her eyes were narrowed into slits. Katherine took the nun's confused expression as a personal victory and refused to break eye contact as Sister Nora took her seat at the top table. As Katherine had expected, Sister Nora reached up to clutch the crucifix around her neck as if trying to absorb strength from it. It was clear she didn't know what to do about Katherine's defiance, and that she didn't like it. The bell dinged once again and everyone tucked into their food, bar Sister Nora. Katherine sneaked a glance at the top table every now and then and noticed that Sister Nora hadn't stopped looking at her. Her plate remained untouched. Katherine placed her cutlery down once more and, in yet another act of defiance, leaned forward to give Sister Nora a smirk of her own. The nun's face turned dark as the madness returned like a shrouded veil. Unexpectedly, the doors burst open, breaking the tension between Katherine and Sister Nora and shattering the silence. In stomped a mangy-looking girl, wearing a tattered short-sleeved frock. Katherine couldn't recollect ever seeing her before. Some of the younger orphans, shocked by the brazen outburst, had dropped their cutlery in fear. One girl knocked over her water glass, resulting in a mess of shattered glass and water all over the table. Shocked and terrified that they'd be punished for having disrupted the silence themselves, some of them began to sob. The young girl who burst into the dining room marched past the orphans, shouting obscenities as she went. "You're a monster!" she shouted. "An evil woman that even God won't be able to save!" Sister Nora abruptly stood up but didn't utter a word. Instead, to Katherine's surprise, she let the girl continue her brazen tirade. Katherine, unbothered by what was happening, scrutinized the girl in the middle of the room. She was quite young, around 11 or 12 years old. Her hair was greasy and matted. She was limping and clutching one of her arms close to her chest. Her ashen face was stained from tears, and her lips were split and quivering uncontrollably. Katherine leaned forward and could see that the arm she was holding was discolored and bent in an odd shape. Katherine clicked her tongue and nodded her head in understanding. This girl had been sent to Sister Nora's office earlier, and this was the unfortunate result of the meeting. Katherine turned her gaze to Sister Nora, trying to gauge how she felt about this extraordinary outburst. She had a scowl that could darken the skies. Her hands were gripping her glass of wine so tightly, Katherine thought it would shatter from the pressure. The girl's outburst wouldn't go unpunished, Katherine surmised. Most likely, this would be the first and last time that Katherine would see this damaged girl. Katherine was numb to the inevitability of her death. It had become a part of her life now, and it no longer shocked her. The quivering girl started to walk towards the head table, her shrill screams echoing throughout the hall as she shouted at Sister Nora. However, she didn't have a chance to get there as Sister Nora had already moved towards her, knocking some of the plates over in the process. The sound of the porcelain hitting the floor and shattering into pieces didn't register with Sister Nora as she focused solely on stopping the girl in her tracks. She flew towards the orphan, sending plates tumbling to the floor in her fury, and her heels clacked against the floor with every forceful step towards the unfortunate orphan. She grasped the young girl's neck, lifting her off her feet and putting an immediate stop to her manic screaming. This was the first time Katherine had seen Sister Nora carry out an abusive act in public. Usually she waited until the darkest part of the night, when everyone was sleeping. Katherine looked around the room, observing everyone's emotions, like a spectator watching a dramatic show. Some of the orphans began to scream hysterically, while others were frozen to their seats, trembling with trepidation. Some clutched each other, their faces red and swollen from the endless tears streaming down. She thought one of the girls was vomiting because she heard retching sounds from one of the tables. The nuns, who had never once lifted their heads at dinner and were always so submissive, were standing up, frozen, eyes wide with fear. Some raised their rosary beads in an act of deep faith, hoping the force of their prayers would make Sister Nora stop her horrific actions, while others kept glancing at the doors, perhaps considering leaving the room. Sister Nora tightened her grip on the young girl, her face twisting in determination. She used her other hand to force the girl backwards, causing her to trip and fall. The girl tried to crawl away from her, but the nun was relentless in her pursuit. Sister Nora bent down and dragged the girl up by her hair, pulling her from the room. The girl begged her to stop, kicking and shrieking as she attempted to get away. She managed to get a grip with her good hand on the doorframe on her way out, but Sister Nora pried her fingers loose, breaking her grip. The door banged shut behind them as they disappeared down the hallway, out of sight of the rest of the witnesses. Katherine could still hear the shrill screams and pleas for mercy, but couldn't hear any verbal response from Nora, only an incessant thumping sound as she presumably hit the girl. The sounds gradually faded away, and the orphans' sobbing had ceased as they slowly regained control of themselves. Silence reigned once more as the sharp clang of metal hitting the floor resounded in the room. Katherine listened intently as she heard a door being opened and heavy footsteps. Sister Nora was speaking to whoever had entered, a man judging by the low timbre of his replies. Then there was the unmistakable sound of something heavy being dragged across the floorboards. Katherine presumed Father Michael had been told to dispose of the body. Sister Nora returned to the dining hall, her face stoic once more. She showed no signs of dishevelment as she made her way back up the room. The orphans looked at each other in confusion, not knowing what to do. Sister Nora barked at everyone to get back in their seats, and they dropped down to the benches, afraid Sister Nora would inflict her remaining wrath on them if they were too slow. Sister Nora sat in her usual spot at the head table, pushing the broken plates aside before looking around the room with narrowed eyes. It was frightening how quickly she had managed to compose herself. Other than a speck of blood on the collar of her habit, no one would guess she'd just committed a murderous act right outside the door. It was as if it hadn't happened at all. She stretched her arm across one of the nuns, who was frozen in her place, and gently picked up the little brass bell on the table. She gave the bell a firm ring and nodded, demanding everyone to return to their meal. It was as if a switch had been flicked. Everyone responded by picking up their spoons and lowering their heads as they returned to their evening meals, not once looking up again. Katherine was astonished at how Sister Nora had regained control of the entire room with just a flick of her wrist. Her attitude demanded absolute obedience, and despite the unmitigated horror of her actions, no one uttered a word or attempted to run away. They were completely bent to her will, her own little pawns that she could do with as she pleased, and because they were so afraid of what she could do to them, no one even considered speaking out against her. Katherine tilted her head to the side in bewilderment. She wondered what it would be like to have that level of control over people. She had never struggled getting people to do what she wanted when she was growing up, but to be able to control an entire building of people, even though you've been abusing and murdering others, was something quite astonishing. If she had that power, she wouldn't have to bow down to anyone anymore. She would no longer be the underdog in the orphanage. Katherine's lips curved into a smile as she stared at what was left of her own food. What a thing that would be, to possess the enormity of power that Sister Nora had. Katherine picked up her spoon and went back to eating her food, pondering this fresh perspective, while Sister Nora sat watching everyone like a hawk as she tightened the chain of the crucifix around her neck. Ah, the darkness. The darkness inherent in it all, everyone. It is deeply worrying. What do we do, though? I will tell you what we do. We continue to 24. It was now March, and Catherine had been obsessing about what it would be like to have Sister Nora's power. It was all she thought about. She had to have it. It didn't matter how many beatings she was subjected to or how many orphans disappeared, because soon she would possess the power to stop it all. She took her beatings without any objections or scornful looks at Sister Nora. The pain didn't even register anymore. The lashings from the riding crop had begun to feel like minuscule pinpricks dancing on her body. There was a new air about Catherine. A darkness was awakening within her, giving her a smug confidence. Once Sister Nora had finished her outbursts of rage, Catherine would stand tall and purposely march out of the room as if nothing had happened, determined to stick to her vow of not showing fear in front of the sadistic nun. She had even managed to utter a sarcastic, "Thank you, sister," at the end of her last session. In the past, her visits to Sister Nora's office would have left her in excruciating pain and clutching her wounds for the rest of the week. But now, she didn't feel anything. The look of unmistakable frustration on Sister Nora's face made it all worthwhile. She took pride in the fact that Sister Nora was never fully satisfied at the end of her escapades. She didn't even bother to hide her wounds anymore. She was numb to the searing pain that was coursing through her body. The only thing that mattered was obtaining the crucifix. Father Michael had noticed subtle changes occurring in Catherine. She was retreating into herself, creating a barrier, distancing herself from what was happening around her. Deep black circles under her eyes indicated she wasn't sleeping enough, and he'd noticed how excessively focused she was on Sister Nora's activities. He had caught her one morning sneaking around, trying to peer through the high windows of her office. Normally, no one would go near it voluntarily. When he confronted her, she stuttered a mediocre excuse about needing to return something to Sister Nora. He didn't believe her, and when he didn't respond immediately, her whole demeanor changed. She straightened her shoulders as the expression on her face transformed from shock to complete disdain. She glared at him through narrowed eyes and sneered at him before she strutted off down the hallway, without giving a second glance back in his direction. With shaking hands, he forced his set of rosary beads from the confines of his pocket and blessed himself. Her actions reminded him of the changes he'd observed in Sister Nora all those years ago. The only difference being that Sister Nora had hidden the changes in her personality until she had obtained the crucifix. If Catherine was displaying the sign of her rising darkness now, what would she be like if she managed to obtain it? There was a sinister side to Catherine, and God help anyone should she have the help of that cursed object. Father Michael's position in the orphanage had its advantages. It enabled him to watch unfolding events from a safe distance as no one paid any attention to the old priest. He guessed Catherine was actively plotting something. One day, during his sermon, he noticed her sitting in a pew near the back of the chapel. She wasn't paying the slightest bit of attention to what he was saying. Instead, she was staring right at Sister Nora. He could have sworn he saw her raise her right hand to her chest, just as Sister Nora often did when adjusting her crucifix. His stomach clenched with fear. The darkness was threatening to take hold of Catherine much faster than it had with Sister Nora. He spent the following few evenings alone in his chamber, with his door locked and barricaded. He didn't feel safe in the orphanage anymore. He contemplated how to approach the troubled girl to discover the extent of the changes. He knew she hated him, and he didn't blame her, not when he turned a blind eye to the abuse she received. But he had to convince her that she must fight the evil force enveloping her soul. Otherwise, nobody would be safe. He had to at least try to prevent history from repeating itself. The following day, he found the courage to approach Catherine. The sky was dull and overcast, with a howling wind, as Father Michael looked out his window at the sky that was threatening to open. He spotted Catherine sitting cross-legged by the statue of Mary in the front yard. She was on her own and was poking the grass with a twig. He grabbed his hat and coat, blessed himself with holy water, and strode off to speak with her. He approached her with caution, the same way someone might try to approach an injured animal to avoid startling it. She seemed oblivious to the cold weather, even though her hands had turned a startling shade of blue. She didn't look up at him as he approached, but she dropped the twig, so he assumed she had sensed his presence. He cleared his throat, preparing to speak, when out of nowhere, Katherine whipped her head around and looked at him through darkened slits for eyes. "Can I help you with something, Father Michael?" she asked in a tone heavy with sarcasm. The wind was whipping her hair around her face, masking the details of her expression. Father Michael froze mid-step. He hadn't anticipated this being so awkward. Her directness had startled him, and the words he'd been planning to say disappeared from his mind. He clenched his fists into tight balls to stop the tremors. He didn't want her to see how nervous he was. Finally he said, "My child, you must come inside. The weather out here is—" "I do not care for your tiresome talks about the weather. Let's not pretend that you suddenly care for my well-being. What is it you want?" she asked. I am worried about you," he stuttered. He knelt beside Katherine, cautious not to get too close, as he wasn't sure how she would react to his proximity. "My dear child, what has happened to you? You are not the same person you were before." Katherine scoffed. "You ask what has happened to me as if you don't know. As if you aren't the cause of some of it. Why are you pretending to care now about what has happened to me?" She yawned. "Doesn't Sister Nora have any more bodies for you to make disappear? Is that what's going on right now, Father? Are you bored?" Father Michael took a shaky breath and sighed. She was clearly pushing him, trying to get him to retaliate, to distract him from why he was speaking with her. But he refused to play her mind games. "There is an obvious darkness growing inside you. I have seen you watch and wait for Sister Nora in the darkest recesses of the hallways. Did you think that no one noticed? I do not know what is going through your head, but I urge you to stop before it's too late. I know what you have been through, and words cannot express how sorry I am for all you've been put through," he said. "These shifts in your behavior are what I warned you about. They are the same as what I saw happen to Sister Nora decades ago. The darkness is threatening to take control of you, as it did her. You do not possess the cursed object she holds so close to her, so please don't let this place push you towards darkness. I beg you to resist it. There will be no turning back if you give in to it." Katherine pursed her lips, picked up the twig once more, and continued shoving it into the grass. She didn't respond to him. He wondered if the wind had prevented her from hearing his pleas. Leaning closer, Father Michael peered at what she was doing and gasped. She hadn't been playing with the twig after all. Unable to fly, an injured bee was crawling between the blades of grass seeking refuge, but Katherine was using the twig to prevent it from escaping, trapping it, then toying with it, letting it think it was free for a moment, then blocking it from going any further. She seemed to be enjoying the insect's distress. "What are you doing? Leave it alone, Katherine. We must not harm any of God's creatures," implored Father Michael as he tried to take the twig from her hand. Katherine snatched her hand away. "Don't touch me!" she shouted. She threw the twig away and chuckled. "It's laughable, really. You must know what a hypocrite you truly are. You care more for this pitiful bug than you do for the children in the building behind us. I believe, if history is any indication, you've caused more harm to God's creatures than I have. I know you helped Sister Nora a few months ago to destroy all evidence of Jane being here, didn't you? I know her uncle wasn't mistaken. She was here before he came looking for her, wasn't she?" Father Michael's back straightened as he absorbed her question. He hadn't been expecting her to be so abrupt, and he froze as the guilt came flooding back. He met her eyes for a brief moment and became frightened at the aggression he saw swirling in them. I I had no choice, he stammered. I couldn't help Jane. She was already dead by the time I got to Sister Nora's office. You know well enough that once Sister Nora has her mind set on someone, the outcome is inevitable. Jane was destined to die long before she entered that office. Sister Nora knew her uncle would be coming to look for her, and she couldn't risk the potential of Jane telling him what she'd endured. The only way to keep her secret safe was for Jane to disappear, as if she had never existed. How did you do it, Father? How did you make a girl disappear entirely from the orphanage? All her photographs and records are gone from the admission files. Did you burn them? Or did you bury all record of her with her own lifeless body? Father Michael began to explain, but Katherine cut him off by raising her hand. There's no point in stammering a false explanation now. Don't pretend to have remorse when you and I both know that you aren't capable of it. You're only capable of self-preservation. But don't forget, I know who you really are and what you've done. For once, how about telling me honestly how you did it? Father Michael sighed. He had no choice but to tell her the truth. I wasn't lying when I said Jane was already dead by the time I got there. And that night, I wasn't called to help dispose of her like I usually am. I was in my office, and I knew something bad must have happened because the convent was too quiet. I couldn't even hear the whistling of wind through the hallway. It was bizarre, but my hands started to shake, and there was this knot in the pit of my stomach. I was jittery, and the flame of the candle on my desk started to flicker before going out, even though there was no air circulating the room. It was like the convent was creating a shroud of darkness. I took it as a sign that I needed to go to Sister Nora, and I was right. I went up the stairs, careful to be discreet, so as not to alert anyone. I knocked on her door, but when she didn't answer, I pushed my way in. Sister Nora was kneeling in front of a large trunk, struggling to fit a girl's legs into it. I thought it was odd that she had opted to use a trunk. She'd never done so before. Katherine raised her eyebrows in confusion. Why not, Father? A trunk seems like a good way to hide a body. Father Michael bit his lip before saying, The bodies don't fit in the trunks. Katherine said nothing to this gruesome admission. Her lips drew into a tight line as she contemplated his words, nodding her head and considering what he was truly admitting to. Her lack of interjection told him that he was safe to carry on with his explanation. I didn't know it was Jane when I walked in, but as soon as I got closer to the trunk, I saw her face clearly. Of course I was shocked. There was nothing I could do at that point. His chin started to tremble. For the sake of the orphanage and Sister Nora, the only option I had was to help make the body disappear. Katherine's attention returned to the bee, but Father Michael sensed she was waiting for him to say more. He swallowed a groan of frustration, realizing there was no point in hiding the gory details from her. We had to break Jane's arms and dislocate her right shoulder to make her fit in the trunk, he said, shaking his head sadly. I haven't been able to get the sound of her little bones snapping from my mind. It took a great amount of effort. His words drifted off as he hung his head. Katherine snapped the twig she'd been holding and tossed it towards the convent, ending Father Michael's stomach-curling story. Startled by the snap, Father Michael glanced up to look at Katherine. He coughed and dusted his hands on his thighs, trying in desperation to distract himself from the swirling storm raging in Catherine's eyes. He continued softly, I don't know how, but Sister Nora knew that Jane's uncle was going to turn up. She never divulges the sources of her information to me. He frowned. That's why she hadn't called me earlier. She had to act fast. She was frantic once the deed was done, and wouldn't stop pacing around the room, muttering under her breath. I couldn't make out what she was saying, as she wasn't speaking in English. It sounded ancient, possibly Latin, but these days my Latin could use a bit of work. He paused. Once I had managed to force the clasp on the trunk closed, I took a better look at Sister Nora. She had taken the crucifix from her neck and was clasping it in both her hands. She was holding it so tightly that her palms started to drip blood onto the floorboards. Wisps of her hair had escaped from underneath her habit, and her eyes were black and frenzied, like a shark that has just tasted its first drop of blood. I hadn't seen her this disheveled before, so it was quite startling. I moved towards her, but she jerked away, snapping out of what I assume was the crucifix's trance. She placed a blood-soaked crucifix back around her neck, staining her skin and gown in the process. But she didn't even flinch as the cold, wet gold touched her. Without looking at me, she barked me that I knew what to do. So I dragged the trunk from the room, leaving Sister Nora alone with the crucifix. After I disposed of the trunk in the back garden, I went through all the rooms in the orphanage, collecting photographs, drawings, and admission files, anything at all which contained her name. I burned them all that very night in the glowing embers that were left in the fire in my chambers. Katherine snorted. It was clear she didn't care for his pitiful excuses. She leaned closer to the ground to get a better view of the injured bee. I won't be leaving this bee alone, Father Michael. You know that no one, including this little bee here, ever truly leaves this place, she said, echoing Sister Nora's initial warning to her. I'm just ensuring it stays here like the rest of us. Father Michael dropped his head in defeat. There was no getting through to Katherine. She refused to see reason. How could he make her see that she was following the same path as Sister Nora? He placed one hand on the statue of Mary and leaned into it to help himself get back to his feet. He dusted the knees of his pants and looked at Katherine in despair. Please, my child, he begged. You are not like her. You do not have the crucifix. Do not give her the power to change you. For everyone's sake. How dare you, she snapped. After everything you have done, yet you preach about the supposed darkness within me. I do believe it was you, Father Michael, who so aptly advised that I was marked and being targeted, was it not? Is it any wonder that I have changed after all of that? I do not need your help or your concern. You're wasting your time even speaking with me. It would be better to use your time to prepare for your next sermon. He sighed. I will pray for you, dear Katherine, he murmured, and shuffled off towards his quarters just as the heavens opened and the rain started pouring down. He glanced behind him one more time at the girl who was willing to choose a path of immense evil. She hadn't moved an inch, even though the rain was soaking her. Instead, she continued her sadistic entrapment of the defenseless bee. Father Michael wiped away the tear that was threatening to spill down his face and returned to the main building. He had a sinking feeling that history was about to repeat itself, and he didn't have any idea how to stop it. The only thing he could do now was pray to the God Almighty to save the souls of those who would be affected by the turmoil created by the shifting balance of the powers of darkness. Katherine waited until she heard the soft thud of the convent's front door closing before she looked up again. She couldn't stop the laughter that tumbled from her mouth. What a foolish man! She didn't care for his little speech, although it had been a nice touch that he had been so honest about the Jane situation. There was no darkness manifesting inside her, attempting to control her. She was well within her senses. She was nothing at all like Sister Nora. In fact, she was far worse. However, he had said one thing which stuck in her throat like sandpaper. "You don't have the crucifix." If he only knew her plan, he'd be quivering in fear. It was true she didn't have the crucifix. Yet. It was the key to taking everything from Sister Nora and destroying her. Father Michael was right about one thing, though. She wasn't going to allow Sister Nora's power to change her. In fact, she wasn't going to give Sister Nora any power at all. She was going to take it for herself. A droplet of rain fell on the bridge of her nose. She looked up at the sky and let out a delighted shriek. She would tackle Sister Nora tonight. With the weather deteriorating, it would be the perfect night to act. No one would hear her movements over the crackling of the thunder. After all, Sister Nora couldn't be completely surprised by the turn of events that was going to happen. It was she who had told her that there was darkness within her. Katherine smiled as she thought, "If only my mother could see me now." How would she have reacted to knowing that she was right all along, that her daughter truly did have a sinister side? Would she be petrified? Would she have sought help from the local priest to try to banish the evil within her? Katherine kicked the ground, dislodging the raindrops from the blades of grass as she imagined her dear mother's shock if she had known what Katherine had in store for the cursed nun. She heard a faint buzz that pulled her from her distracted thoughts and searched the ground. For a moment she had forgotten about the injured bee lying victim in the grass. A parade of red ants had started to close in on the bee, waiting for the opportune moment to attack, when it was at its most vulnerable. Katherine tilted her head to the side and watched in twisted admiration as they circled around their prey. The bee was destined to die alone and in pain, at the mercy of whatever larger insect happened to come along. She thought it oddly poetic that the tiny ants circling the bee, threatening to consume it, were so much smaller than their victim. It was as if she was watching her own story play out in front of her, and how she would overcome Sister Nora. She smiled again before crouching down to pluck the legs off the bee, hindering it from escaping and ensuring its demise. She jumped up and wiped her hands on her dress, then walked towards her dorm room with a newfound pep in her step, just as the red ants started to descend upon the bee. Dang, guys, this book has gone dark. I hope you're enjoying it. I don't think we have a lot left to go here, but we will continue to read until it is finished. So, quick sip, and then we will continue. "25. The earlier rain of the day had given way to a torrential thunderstorm. Katherine couldn't remember the last time she had seen weather this bad. The grounds were beginning to flood, and all outdoor chores were suspended as Sister Nora didn't want any unnecessary mud being dragged through the hallways. The orphans were given a supper of stale bread and curdling milk and were sent to bed. They all made their way up the creaky wooden stairs towards their bedrooms with only the flickering glow of candlelight to guide them as they went. Katherine marched into her room and gazed out her window at the chaotic weather raging outside. Some of the girls were anxious about the thunderstorm, but Katherine welcomed the raucous claps of thunder and lightning with open arms. Sister Nora would be doing her rounds soon, so Katherine picked up her rosary beads in preparation for her nightly prayers. But as she was about to kneel down, a thought surfaced. Why was she persisting with Sister Nora's tiresome routine? She was only a few hours away from having the ability to control everyone around her, of being in total control of her own life. So why waste time playing the submissive pawn? She scolded herself and threw the rosary beads across the room. They landed with a soft thud and rattled across the floor. They were probably broken, but this didn't bother her in the slightest. She strode over to her bed, hitched up her nightdress, and sat cross-legged on the mattress, staring at the slit in the door, willing Sister Nora to hurry up and begin her rounds. At last, despite the rumbling of the storm, she heard the unmistakable sound of Sister Nora's heels striking the floorboards and door hatches being opened and shut. Katherine held her breath in anticipation as the footsteps grew closer and closer to her room, then halted. She squinted at the gap underneath her door and recognized the shadow of Sister Nora's feet. Katherine whipped her head up just as Sister Nora flung open the hatch on her door. It took Katherine a few seconds for her eyes to adjust to the brightness of the candlelight, but once they had, she stared boldly at the nun. She tilted her head and sneered at Sister Nora, inviting her to chastise her. But she must have caught the nun off guard, because her eyes widened in shock as she peered into the room. They held each other's gaze for a few seconds before Sister Nora snapped her head back and slammed the hatch shut. Katherine could have sworn she heard the woman growl in frustration. Katherine grinned as the sound of Sister Nora's footsteps grew fainter. Oh, how she had enjoyed the look of fear she had glimpsed in the nun's eyes. It was the first time she had ever retreated from Katherine, rather than reaching for the crucifix hanging on her neck. Katherine felt powerful and in control, and she couldn't wait to embody that feeling every day. A flash of lightning brought Katherine back to the present moment. A thrill of excitement coursed through her. Only a few more hours to go before she could spring into action. She waited, lying on the dusty floorboards, her ear pressed firmly against them, waiting for the familiar hum of the organ to begin playing. It wasn't long before she could feel the vibration against the palms of her hands. That was her cue to begin. She shoved her bed frame aside and retrieved the wire she'd hidden. Catching sight of the Judas carving in the wood, she laughed like a hyena. It was so ironic to think that only a few weeks ago she had detested being associated with Judas, but now she fully embraced the idea, accepting that she didn't have to hide that part of herself anymore. She fiddled with the wire until she heard the familiar click of the lock opening. Swinging the door open, she took a deep breath and stepped out into the hallway, on shaky legs. A combination of nerves and excitement was making her jittery. She tossed the wire back into her room and strutted down the hallway, without closing the door behind her. There was no need to fear the wrath of the nuns any more. They would learn to fear her by the time dawn arose. Her breath beat so fast she thought her heart might burst through her chest at any moment. Katherine began to sprint towards the direction of the chapel, her breathing becoming ragged, and she stumbled once or twice on the freezing cold floors. She cursed herself for not putting on her shoes before she left her room. No doubt her feet would be grazed and cut by the end of the night. There were no candles alight in the orphanage, as they had all been snuffed out earlier when the nuns had retired to bed. Katherine had to rely solely on the sporadic flash of light coming through the windows from the lightning to guide her. As she neared the heavy chapel doors, her ears had begun to ring, and adrenaline was coursing through her body. With every step she took, the vibration and the hum of the organ grew louder. She skidded to a stop and placed her quivering palms on the doors, then rested her head between them. This was it. This was her moment. Everything was about to change. She would no longer be subjected to the vindictive abuse from that evil woman. Katherine's plan was simple. She would use the element of surprise to her advantage. Sister Nora wouldn't be expecting anyone to intrude, and if she moved fast enough, Katherine was sure she could overpower her and rip the crucifix from her neck. She expected a struggle. Sister Nora wouldn't part willingly with the crucifix, but Katherine was prepared to do whatever whatever was necessary to obtain what she felt was rightfully hers, even if it meant ending Sister Nora's life in the process. However, she hoped to avoid that. She wanted the nun alive so she could live in fear of her and her capabilities. Katherine would be in complete control, able to exact revenge for Nora's treatment of the orphans. It was what she deserved. She deserved to live under the shroud of a menacing figure, just as they had. How would Sister Nora react to her intrusion? Would she be surprised by Katherine's retaliation, or scared? Would she beg for mercy just as the dead orphans had done with her, and mimic their desperate cries? A shudder of excitement raced through her, and, taking a deep breath, she burst through the doors, a huge grin adorning her face. But as soon as she stepped across the threshold, her smile faltered. All her anticipation came crashing down. There was no one there. The chapel was empty, illuminated only by the moonlight shining in through the stained glass windows. The organ was covered with an old sheet with no evidence of it having been used since Father Michael's service earlier that evening. Katherine was utterly astonished. What was going on? This is surely just a bad dream, Katherine thought. She inspected each pew as if, by some miracle, she would find an answer to the mystery. Perhaps someone had been playing a trick on her. Was this just another one of Sister Nora's cruel mind games? Did she know I was coming? Thought Katherine. She spun around in disbelief. She had spent so long plotting and anticipating the moment when she would take back control of her life and gain all that power. She hadn't even considered what her next step would be if her grand plan failed. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She broke into a cold sweat as she shuffled up to the altar. She passed by the open Bible at the pulpit, her fingers running over the wood as she walked closer. Ordinarily, she wouldn't have cared to even give the pages a second glance, but some of the words stood out to her, flashing like a beacon and inviting her to give the page a closer inspection. She realized that this wasn't the usual Bible that Father Michael would have read from during his sermons. The frayed pages and the thick dust gathering in the spine indicated that it must have been quite old. She blew on the pages to get rid of the excess dust and let out a deep cough as the musty clouds settled again. The Gospel of Luke was hidden beneath the shroud of smut in faded black words. There was one sentence which had been circled multiple times and underlined with black ink. Then Satan entered Judas. Katherine scoffed to herself. How fitting it was that this should be the prime sentence on the page. Her eyes scrolled down the rest of the page, her finger following the words as she read them. When she reached the end of the page, she noticed the sheet was puckered, as though something was behind it. She turned it over, and her eyes widened in shock. Someone had defiled the Bible, and now it was splattered with ink. The entire page of text had been written over with words that chilled her soul. You have the devil inside you. You are marked. Katherine slammed the Bible shut and stepped back, knocking over a candelabra. The sound of the brass hitting the marble floor echoed through the empty chapel. It was no coincidence that she should come face to face with text of such magnitude. That statement had been thrown in her face since the day she first arrived at the orphanage. She'd been correct. Someone had deliberately set her up. She raised her arms to grasp her head and groaned in frustration. As she threw her head back, she noticed a strange shadow suddenly move in the gallery above. She squinted and the shadow gradually came into focus. A woman was moving towards the center of the gallery, and as she reached out to grip the brass railing, something glinted and her whole face came into view. Of course it was Sister Nora, dark eyes alight with malice and that vile smirk on her face as she peered down at Katherine. Consumed with anger and her desire to enact her plan, Katherine moved hastily towards the gallery, fully prepared to do whatever it took to get that crucifix. She charged towards the altar steps, but, feeling faint, she stopped, gripping the nearby pew to steady herself. She glared up at Sister Nora, but she had gone. All Katherine could hear was her own staggered breathing. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, she counted under her breath. She had to remain calm and push past the unsteadiness. She just needed a few seconds to focus. Where did she go? She wondered. Still gripping the pew, she squinted into the darkness, just as a voice emerged from the shadows behind her. You still haven't learned. Nothing happened within these walls without me knowing. I know everything. I've been watching you for the past few weeks. I've seen the blazing desire in your eyes. I know what you want, Sister Nora said. She laughed and shoved Katherine further into the pew. Katherine, already wobbly, toppled over and fell to the floor. This wasn't how she imagined her plan would unfold. She had gone over every possible outcome, but none had included ending up at the mercy of Sister Nora. She kicked her legs, trying to wriggle out from Sister Nora's reach, but the nun grabbed her leg mid-kick and pulled her back towards the altar. Let me go, Katherine shouted. She tried to grab hold of anything solid to halt her capture, but it was no use. The madwoman had her in the trap. But she wasn't willing to give up without a fight. If Sister Nora was intending to end her life, she wouldn't make it easy for her. Katherine's body felt heavy, her limbs refusing to respond to her desperate will to fight back. Since the very first moment I lay eyes on you, I knew you were trouble. Lurking around corners, trying to weasel your way into things that you had no business being a part of. You, she said, while tilting her head towards the cemetery, are just as disposable as they are. What did you think you could achieve? That you'd take my crucifix for yourself, free the oppressed children and allow them into the light, restore the convent to its former glory, she said. No, you see, Katherine, I don't believe that. It was blatantly obvious that you wanted the crucifix for yourself, but you don't really care about what happens to the other children. I know you, and I know what lies are concealed within your soul. Sister Nora jammed a finger at her. You just want the power to fuel your own dark desires. You want to be the one in control. Well, I'm sorry to inform you, that won't be possible. And just as you don't care about the others, they don't care about you. I'm certain they won't be whispering amongst themselves when you fail to appear tomorrow morning. Distraught, Katherine looked around wildly in a futile attempt to find something to use for protection. She turned back and her eyes widened as Sister Nora seized a chalice from the altar above and held it aloft. Katherine threw her arms up to protect her face, just as the double doors of the chapel burst open. She heard two sets of footsteps running up the aisle. Sister Nora, consumed with her rage, was oblivious to the interruption. She raised the chalice higher and struck it against Katherine's head. Katherine screamed out in pain and brought her hands down to cradle her now pulsing skull. Her heart felt like it was beating in her ears. Gingerly, she removed one hand. It was covered in blood. Sister Nora grinned, a maniacal glint in her eye as she prepared to deliver another blow. Suddenly, the chalice clattered to the floor and the nun was dragged away, kicking and screaming. Still struggling with the pain in her head, Katherine rolled over sluggishly onto her forearms. "Get up, Katherine! There's no time!" a voice said. It took a few seconds for Catherine's eyes to steady before she recognized Grace and Lauren as the two people who had pulled Sister Nora away from her. "We heard the shouting from our room," Lauren said. "We knew it must have been you, and we wanted to help. We spent too long being afraid of her." Sister Nora was struggling to reach Katherine with the vice grip that Lauren and Grace had on her arms. Her anger was boiling over, and froth was beginning to form at the corners of her mouth. "Just as well we came when we did," said Grace, smirking. "Otherwise your head would have ended up looking worse than mine." Despite her pain, Katherine couldn't help but chuckle, even though the movement hurt her head more. Sister Nora was wrong. The orphans did care for each other here, or, at the very least, they cared enough to unite against their tormentor when it mattered most. Katherine staggered to her feet and weighed up her options. The blood from her head dripped onto the white marble steps beneath her. Sister Nora was struggling to free herself from the vice-like grip that both girls had on her arms. Her black eyes were frenzied, and she was foaming at the mouth like a rabid animal. Her hysterical shrieks resounded through the chapel. If she were to get loose, Katherine dreaded the terrible repercussions for all of them. They won't be able to hold her for long, Katherine thought. She had to act fast. Katherine marched up the steps just as Sister Nora managed to snatch her arm away from Grace. With one arm free and a force unlike any other, she pushed Grace into the lectern, causing her to stumble headfirst into a pillar before her body rolled down the steps. Her head cracked as it collided with the floor. "No!" Lauren screamed as she released her grip on Nora and rushed towards her lifeless friend. A dark crimson stream of blood was beginning to pool around Grace's head, the metallic smell filling the air. "What have you done? Grace, wake up! Come on, wake up!" She shook Grace's body. Sister Nora stalked towards Lauren as she wailed over Grace. With her back now towards Katherine, this was her opportunity. She charged at Sister Nora, shouldering her out of Lauren's pathway and knocking her to the ground. Katherine faltered. The pain in her head was making her dizzy, but this small win gave her the impulse to carry on. She spied the chalice lying where it had fallen from Sister Nora's murderous clutches just minutes before. As the nun struggled back to her feet, Katherine grabbed it and pounded it against her head, just as she had done to her. The shock of the initial impact brought Sister Nora down to her knees. Katherine's mind flashed back to past images of beatings in the nun's office, the pain and isolation, and the tender moments she had spent with Sister Sorcia, who had been so cruelly taken from her. Fueled by an insurmountable rage, she raised the chalice again. She couldn't let her live now. Sister Nora would never submit to her, so vengeance was the only option. She crashed the chalice against her head over and over again, each blow growing stronger as the adrenaline pulsed through her body. Sister Nora's body grew weak, and her eyes started to flutter shut. Throwing the chalice to one side, Katherine used both of her hands and wrapped them around Sister Nora's neck, squeezing so hard that bruises started to form beneath her fingertips. The nun's eyes bulged from the pressure, and her hands became limp. Katherine suddenly dropped her hand from Sister Nora's neck, allowing her to collapse in a heap on the altar. She couldn't just let her die just yet. She had to witness Katherine's triumph over her former oppressor. Understand that she was no longer in control. It had to be the very last thing she saw before she died. Katherine leaned over Sister Nora's dying body and smirked. "Looks like I'm the one in control now," she said as she ripped the crucifix from the woman's neck and placed it around her own. Finally. She thought. The gold chain now rested comfortably against her chest, where it belonged. She closed her eyes and smiled in pure bliss. She glanced down at the woman beneath her. "I'm now the only god within these walls. I won." Despite only a whisper of life remaining in Sister Nora's body, She reached a shaking arm towards the crucifix that had been taken from her. Even in her final moments, the power of the crucifix was calling out to her. But her injuries were too severe, and, with a final shudder, she dropped her arm to the floor and her head rolled to one side as she finally succumbed to Catherine's revenge. Sister Nora's death brought a heavy silence to the chapel. The only sounds came from Lauren as she sobbed, mourning the loss of her friend. Katherine glanced over at them. She was sorry that Grace had died. Both girls had gone out of their way to help her. Had it not been for their intrusion, she most likely would not have succeeded. However, she couldn't allow the pity she felt to distract her. "She's gone, Lauren," Katherine said as she approached the grieving girl. "Let her rest. There's nothing more you can do for her now." She placed what she thought was a comforting hand upon Lauren's shoulder and guided her away from the sickening scene in front of her. "Grace said once that the lucky ones are those who leave this place. She's one of the lucky ones now. Try to focus on that." "What are you talking about, Katherine? Sister Nora is gone now. She can't hurt anyone any more," Lauren said, sniffling and wiping her nose on her sleeve. "Grace didn't have to die. You have the crucifix now. Things would have been different for Grace if she'd lived. She wouldn't have to be afraid of her any more." Katherine dropped her hand from Lauren's shoulder and straightened her back, thinking, "Things are going to be different, sure, but I wouldn't say you have nothing to fear anymore." Lauren must have sensed foreboding in Katherine's silence because she raised her head and said, "Katherine, what's going on?" Lauren backed away slowly, but Katherine only smiled at the girl. "Nothing is going on, Lauren. You're right. Things are going to be different from now on. Grace is gone, but you don't have to be afraid. I'll handle this mess. Look, you've been through a great ordeal tonight, so you need to rest. Head back to the dorm, and do not utter a word of what took place to anyone tonight. They won't understand," she said with a forceful tone. Lauren nodded, but her expression was guarded. Katherine knew the girl didn't believe her. Lauren stared at the crucifix resting against Katherine's chest and retreated further, eyes wide with fear and never leaving Katherine's figure until she reached the doors of the chapel. With a fumbling hand, she managed to push them open just enough to slip through them and bolt back to her dorm. Katherine sighed. She's going to be a problem. I'll need to take care of her eventually, but not now. I'll leave her to stew in her fear until it consumes her. It'll be more fun that way, she thought. Katherine sat down on the bloody altar steps and raised her hand to her head. The pain had started to subside, but she would be left with a nasty scar, an eternal reminder of what she had done, of what she could do. Her gaze rested on the two bodies, and she felt nothing. Sister Nora got what she deserved, and Grace had been collateral damage. Despite what Lauren thought, Grace was one of the lucky ones. She would never have been able to survive what was to come. Reaching for the crucifix, Katherine clasped it tight against her chest. She started to rock back and forth as she burst out laughing, the sound echoing through the chapel. "Yes, I will take care of things here," she said. "Nothing is going to get in my way now." 26. I need to hit the chapter button before I start into 26. The darkness, everyone, the darkness inherent in all of this is evil. 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 With the fruits of the devil. All right. Let's move into the next chapter, shall we? 26. 1873. The horse and trap once again rounded the corner and pulled up slowly at the main doors of the orphanage, the sound of the horse's hooves signifying the arrival of another orphan to the Convent of Mercy. The young, terrified orphan with her little bundle trudged up the steep steps to wait for whoever was in charge to guide her where to go. As she reached the top step, a figure emerged from the long, dark hallway behind the main doors. This must be the Reverend Mother, she thought. The nun's low black heels clicked on the stones as she approached the girl. An ornate gold crucifix hanging from the neck swayed into view. "Welcome, child. I'm Sister Katherine." Well, that was a short chapter. And now we'll just move right into epilogue. So, you see, kid, she didn't just kill a few kids, as you so kindly put it. She destroyed herself and her entire humanity to get the crucifix and the power it held. She was possessed. There's no other logical explanation for it. No woman of God would have done the things she did, committed such atrocities, if she wasn't under the control of a dark force. And that, everyone, is the reason why we are all here tonight, the tour guide said, clasping his hands together. To walk in the footsteps of evil and understand what life was like for those poor orphans, all those years ago, some of whom suffered a fate far worse than death. He glanced at his wristwatch. Have a look around, get a feel for the place, and we'll meet back at the end of the stairs in, let's say, 10 minutes. Some of the group flocked towards the end of the hallway, eager to see as much of the dormitory as possible, given their small window of time. Malcolm withdrew and hung back from the rest of the group. He didn't care to look deeper into the lives of some nuns who had lived and died long before his time. However, the story of Sister Katherine had intrigued him more than he was willing to admit, so he decided to take a quick walk about her room. He waited until the group had moved away so he could inspect the notorious nun's room on his own. He couldn't risk his mother seeing him. If she thought he was showing the slightest interest in the whole fiasco, he would be stuck listening to her ramble on forever. He scanned the bare room in front of him. It wasn't what he'd expected. He'd heard that if you stepped into a space where evil had resided, where brutal acts were carried out, you could feel an ominous sensation in the room, as if the perpetrator was still there, watching your every move. But this just felt like any other empty, dusty room. He was a little bit disappointed. He kicked his boot on one of the deep grooves embedded in the floorboards, stirring up some ancient smut in the process, and took a turn about the room. He was disillusioned when he didn't find any mysterious items. He looked out through the cracked window and saw the old graveyard outside. He shuddered, imagining how creepy it would have been to sleep so near to dead, rotting people. Malcolm sat down on the creaky little bed and cracked his knuckles while he thought about the tale he'd just heard. If the graveyard part had been true, then what else had the tour guide been truthful about? He stood up and, as quietly as he could, pushed aside the bed. To his surprise, there lay the carvings of the silver coins that had been given to Judas and that Sister Katherine had been marked with. Malcolm glanced at the door, wondering if his mother had noticed his absence. He tiptoed to the door and gently pushed it a little to conceal his snooping, then kneeled by the bed to get a closer look at the markings. They were quite faded, but there was no mistaking them. The markings were real. Curious, he ran his fingers over the circular symbols. As soon as his fingertips touched the etching, a shudder ran through his body, and he suddenly felt as if a large weight had settled itself on his back. A vicious gust of wind swirled through the cracked window, forcing the bedroom door to click shut. Malcolm jumped. With the door fully closed, the room was beginning to feel more sinister, and he took this as his cue to leave. He moved the bed back to its original place and hurried to the door, eager to get as far away from the place as possible. But when he tried to open it, the door wouldn't budge. He was about to call out for help when he stopped short. A dull, raspy voice was whispering his name. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and his eyes widened in fear. He turned around slowly, afraid of what he might see, and rested his back flush against the door. His eyes darted nervously around the room, trying to make sense of where the voice was coming from. Finding no obvious answer, he decided his mind had been playing tricks on him. But then the voice whispered his name again, so clearly this time there was no doubt. Something was speaking to him. "The sill," the eager voice whispered to him. He gulped and wondered if he was going crazy because he couldn't get the door open anyway. He shuffled over to the window sill to see if anything would happen. There was nothing out of the ordinary about the sill, but he knocked gently against the wood. The empty sound indicated the sill was hollow. He frowned, noticing a small gap in the architecture, inserted his fingers in it, and pulled. The wood, caked in cobwebs, came away. He leaned it against the wall and peered inside the hole, which was serving as a small storage space. Much to his disappointment, he found nothing of significance hidden in the space, just some old faded prayer books and a string of rosary beads which had been wrapped up in a muslin bag decorated with a cross. He examined the space again, amazed at how deep it was, and came across a dirty piece of cloth, yellowed with age, that was securely tied with a piece of string. He pulled it out and felt a strange sensation, like a strong urge to pull the string open as if his life depended on it. He fumbled with the tight bow, opening the cloth and revealing the object that tumbled straight into his awaiting hand. He raised his eyebrows as he shook his head. Nestled in his hands was the notorious Crucifix the guide had said was responsible for the reign of terror at the orphanage, the relic that both paranormal experts and the church had desperately sought for so long. And it had been found by him, a boy who hadn't even known about the orphanage's dark past until a few hours ago. He held the crucifix up by the gold chain, the ornate gold gleaming and glistening as if it were brand new. "Malcolm, where are you?" Malcolm jumped at the sound of his mother's shrill voice, and he quickly tossed a piece of string of the cloth back into the secret space. He placed the missing piece of timber back in its place, but kept a tight grip on the crucifix. No one would know what he had found. He intended to keep it for himself. Why would the voice reveal its hiding place if it wasn't meant to belong to him? He relished the idea of what he could do if he possessed the power of the crucifix. The bedroom door swung open just as he dropped the crucifix safely in his pocket. "What the hell are you doing? Come on, we're all headed back downstairs," his mother snapped at him. Malcolm rolled his eyes as he skulked out the door. If she only knew what he had found, she wouldn't dare to speak to him like that. He made his way downstairs to join the rest of the group, stopping on the last step to place the stolen crucifix around his neck. "Malcolm!" his mother shouted again from the entry hall ahead of him. His face darkened at her incessant nagging. He didn't need to listen to her giving out to him any more. He bypassed the rest of the group and strode out the main door of the orphanage, ignoring the rain that was pouring down. He leaned against the decaying statue in front of the building, stroking the crucifix in awe. Looking up, he marveled at a bright flash of lightning in the sky as he clutched the crucifix to his chest and smiled. Why wait, he thought. He had received enough scolding after his last suspension to last him a lifetime. Everyone treated him like an outcast, even his own mother. So why wait to make her feel sorry for her actions when he could just act right now? A shame for the rest of the group, maybe. They hadn't done anything to hurt him, but then again, they were all ridiculous fanatics, and one really shouldn't go looking for evil. They would all be sorry. He smiled broadly and strode back to the main building, slamming the door shut behind him. An eerie silence descended upon the grounds just before the screaming began from within. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of the Crucifix. I hope you guys have enjoyed this reading of the Crucifix written by Naomi Cashman, performed for you by your humble narrator, Tim Maloney. Once again, if you have missed any portion of the story tonight, you will be able to check it out later this evening on the YouTube channel, once I get it all finished and uploaded. As always, thank you for coming along to spend a little bit of time with me this evening. The greatest gift that you can give me is the gift of your time, and I appreciate that you guys gave me the gift of yours this evening, whether it was for 5 minutes or for the whole stream. I will be on vacation for the next little bit, so no stream for the next week and a half. But then I'll be back, and we'll have a new indie author book to read. Until then, I hope you guys have a wonderful week ahead, a fantastic rest of your weekend, and I look forward to seeing you guys all again really soon. Good night, everyone.